We can see folks trickling in this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are joining from. Thank you for your patience while we were working to get all of the panelists on board. We're going to get started in just one moment to allow for as many attendees to join as possible. So thank you again for your patience this morning. And I think we can go ahead and get started. So, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I want to thank you and welcome you to today's interactive discussion. We are organizing today with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, and UN Women. This session is part of a joint collaboration to share and discuss the principles explored in the Gender and Security Toolkit. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants as well as hosted on DCAF's YouTube channel. Before we start, I want to go over a few housekeeping issues. Interpretation is being provided today for English into French, Russian, Georgian, and Spanish. I will take this opportunity to remind all panelists to speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can work effectively. During this webinar, all participants will be in listen-only mode with microphones muted. After our first four expert presenters, we will open the floor for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please ask it using the Q&A feature. You can do this at any point while the presenters are speaking. You don't need to wait until the end. We will read out as many of your questions out as possible to the panelists and allow them to respond. You can ask questions in the chat, in the Q&A, in any of the languages provided today. If you're interested in a response from a particular panelist, please indicate who you are directing your question to. At the end of today's webinar, we will share a link to a brief evaluation survey. We encourage all participants to provide your honest feedback on today's session on that 4-minute survey. Your feedback is valuable to us and helps us choose the topics for the next sessions and refine the format for the following webinars in this series. In just a moment, I will quickly share a brief poll asking all of you to respond with which language you are accessing this webinar in. Please take a moment to respond to the poll that I am sharing right now. At this point, I'd like to hand things over to our facilitator, for opening remarks, to our esteemed colleague, Isabella Hartman, who's going to lead us through today's opening of today's session. Thank you so much. I think, Isabella, the floor is yours.
Isabella, did you want to take the floor now, or because otherwise I will just go ahead. Thank you so much, Natasha, and very, very warm welcome to all our participants today to the expert panel that we have, a quite impressive and distinguished panel of experts at today's seminar. On behalf of our co-hosts today, it's really my pleasure to welcome you all. I see we have about more than 180 participants online, which I think is great, but I'm not surprised because it is an exciting issue, and it will be an exciting webinar that we have today. Before we start, I should thank my colleagues really from ODIHR's Human Rights and Gender and Security team for having me as guest moderator really in this session, which I'm of course very, very honored to do. The real brains and experts behind this webinar today are Isabella Silvia Hartmann, my colleague, the Human Rights Officer at ODIHR, and Alvaro Gomez del Valle Ruiz, who is assistant program officer and has been really behind the organization of this webinar from the ODIHR side. Now, as Natasha mentioned, this webinar is one of a series which is based on the Gender and Security Toolkit, a set of resources which was jointly published by UN Women, OSCE, ODIHR, and DCAF last year. The toolkit is now available in, I understand, in full in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic, plus some parts of it also in 9 other languages. The Gender and Security Toolkit offers guidance on how to promote gender equality within the security and justice sector, and how the security and justice sector can really better contribute to achieving gender equality in broader society. Toolkit number 14 on intelligence and gender, which we are looking at today, looks into an issue which really is very often underexplored and as part of the security sector when it comes to gender. So the tool describes why gender is important, and for intelligence services, how an intelligence service that raises and promotes gender equality is better suited to fulfill its mandate. And it does share some good practices in this regard. So these will be some of the questions we will be looking at today, which are explored in this toolkit. We'll look at what are good practices when it comes to integrating gender into the work of intelligence services, their collection and analysis of information, how to best integrate a gender analysis into the work of intelligence services, into surveillance practices, intelligence strategies, and so on. And of course, also what are the gendered risks that the use of surveillance technologies and practices by intelligence agencies entail. And last but not least, we'll also look into the role of oversight bodies in this area. So to answer these and to shed light on these questions, as I said, we have quite an impressive and distinguished panel of experts with us today, from law enforcement, from civil society, from academia, who will shed light on these very, very interesting questions that we will be talking about today. Before hearing from them, I would just briefly like to introduce them. We have first with us Ms. Aleksandra Bakrevska-Dodovska, who is Deputy Director of the Intelligence Agency of North Macedonia. Ms. Bakrevska-Dodovska has over 2 decades of experience in the intelligence services. She has occupied also a number of other roles, including the head of Department for International Cooperation, EU and NATO. Then we have with us Ms. Irene Potranto, Senior Researcher of Citizens Lab. Citizens Lab is an interdisciplinary lab on digital technology and human rights at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Ms. Potranto is also a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and her research focuses on digital security and identity politics, including gender, intersectionality, surveillance, as well as countering terrorism, violent extremism, and hate speech online. Then we have Mark Dixon. Very pleased to see you again, Mark. Mark Dixon is Chief of Police Development, the Police Development Unit in the OSCE mission to Skopje. He has over 35 years of policing and security experience, both in the United Kingdom and working in international organizations. He has worked on intelligence collection, including surveillance operations and the use of covert human intelligence sources. He worked on counterterrorism operations and investigations, and has also supported, he did so in the UK, but he has also supported Kosovo institutions in the development of the 1325 National Action Plan and gender assessments in the context of security reforms. And he has also worked in capacity building relating to sexual and gender-based violence investigations. And last but not least, we have Sarah Miriam Brilly, who's a consultant with the UN Peacekeeping Intelligence Coordination Team and professor at Bishop's University in Canada. Dr. Martine Brilly has been researching, teaching, and publishing on UN peace operations in Africa, peacekeeping intelligence, and gender for over 15 years. And she has, for example, drafted the Joint Mission Analysis Center Field Handbook, which was released last year, not last year, in 2018, by the UN Operations and Crisis Center. She has published on peacekeeping intelligence, UN peacekeeping intelligence, and this is her main area that she will be speaking about today. So again, a very warm welcome to a very, very distinguished expert panel, and a very warm welcome again to our participants. I see the numbers increasing. We have almost reached 200 now. So without further ado, I would turn to our participants, to our panelists, and I would like to first ask Ms. Bakrevska-Dodovska two questions, if I may. I will do so at the same time. As someone with over 2 decades of experience in intelligence, why do you think gender is relevant for your work? What are the impacts and benefits of taking gender nuanced approaches to intelligence? And then if you could also tell us a little bit more about the steps. Your agency has taken some important steps to mainstream gender into the functioning and operations. If you could tell us a little bit more about that, and whether you see some good practices in this regard from your experience. Ms. Bakrevska-Dodovska, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for your invitation to participate on this webinar on integrating a gender perspective in intelligence services. From my point of view, this is a relevant topic for discussions and should bring more awareness on the importance of integrating a women's perspective within the intelligence work. According to me, the gender perspective has a significant importance for the intelligence work. Concerning our experience, now I will speak out of the experience I have. You mentioned 2 decades in the intelligence agency, and everything that I will speak on this webinar will be out of that experience. For many years, men have been the main focus in the work and functioning of the intelligence agency. But as a consequence of this fact, and due to the global geopolitical changes and world progress in general, the intelligence lacked women perspective in collection, analysis, and decision-making processes. It is a fact that women perceive things differently. They have different approach in field. They have different perspective when analyzing data and information. And finally, they make different decisions. I believe, deeply believe, that the mixture of men's and women's perspective will guarantee better functioning of the agency, offer comprehensive analysis and provide better results. However, we must take into consideration that there are certain constraints and factors which disable women to integrate in intelligence. I would mention only a few. Traditional attitudes. Women in our society were more encouraged to be dedicated to the families and raising children, or constraints from broader social and cultural attitudes like gender stereotypes, cultural restrictions, or risk of stigmatization. That is the first one. The second one, the lack of courage to confront men in intelligence. The third one is trying to gain a degree of respect within the agency, which will determine their willingness to engage. And the last but not least, women have been and still are focused and dedicated to the fundamentals of work and did not want to burden the agency with something that was considered as a subsidiary, something of subsidiary importance. Women will be more encouraged to work and integrate in the intelligence services if the state finds mechanisms and introduces policies and legislation aimed at increasing female presence in intelligence. This is in general about the first question. Concerning the second question, I can say that the intelligence agency was established by law in 1995 and started functioning in 1998. All the time, all these years until recently, the intelligence was a sphere of work mainly dominated by men, not only in numbers, but also in the way of thinking and operating. The changes have started recently with the new leadership of the agency, which came in the second half of 2019, and the law on intelligence agency passed in 2021. It is a fact that women have been part of building of the institution since the very beginning. They have been dedicated workers, co-workers, wives, mothers, and friends. However, there have been spheres in the agency that belonged only to men, and those were operations and senior management levels. These were men-dominated spheres. And through the years, women failed to raise these very important issues. The first bold step was made with the new law on the intelligence agency and the reforms that were undertaken. The Article 27 of the intelligence agency prohibits discrimination based on many bases, including gender. And this is the first time that we envisage by law that we prohibit discrimination based on gender, and the gender is mentioned for the first time within the framework of the intelligence agency. But this is only one side of the story. There is another story which says you cannot do it if you don't have human factor, which means you cannot realize the goals if some of the leaders do not understand them. Luckily, the current director and leadership understand the importance of gender perspective in the intelligence work, and the result are out of all managerial positions, in the intelligence agency, 45% are women. And I will make a slight comparison with other years. For example, in 2015, that percentage was 29. And in 2018, the percentage was 28. So we, in these last 2 years, we have increased in the women who are in leadership position. And the total number of employed women in the agency is 34%. Also, what is very important is that now women are part of the senior management level, and women do coordinate operational work. I think these steps are very crucial and very bold steps for the integrating of gender perspective in intelligence service. The second very bold step that we are doing for the first time is that in the program for 2022, the agency mentions that the gender inequality is among the risks that influence the security of the states and NATO. This year is the first time we mention in the program the importance of the gender perspective. However, I must mention that these are only pioneering steps of the intelligence agency. We have a lot to do in future and to find more mechanisms that will guarantee women's inclusion in the intelligence work. This is briefly the facts that I wanted to present during this webinar. Because the time is limited, I will give space for other panelists.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for really also underlining the importance of first of all, having a solid legal basis, but then also further steps to translate the legal basis into practice, which is often very often lacking. We see in a male-dominated institutions in the field. So thank you so much for that. And we'll have more opportunity to go into some of the other questions later on. I would like to turn now to the second panelist, Ms. Irene Potranto. If I may, I will also combine the questions because they are also very similar, but if you need me to ask the second question again later on, I can repeat it. The question to you is, why is gender important when it comes to surveillance? Could you tell us about the work that you and more broadly Citizens Lab does on this issue? And then the second aspect of it would be, and obviously we have seen in the past some troubling instances of spyware, of surveillance spyware, like most recently the Pegasus issue, which appeared quite a lot in the media. How such tools are being misused by intelligence agencies, and does this have gendered implications as well? Is this part of a broader trend that you observe? You have the floor.
Thank you, Johannes, for these great questions. And thank you to the OSCE, ODIHR, DCAF and UN Women for hosting this event and for inviting me to participate. So first, for those of you who are not familiar with the Citizen Lab, I'll just explain it briefly. So the Citizen Lab is a cyber security and human rights research lab based at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. Since 2001, we have been conducting investigations into various various kinds of digital attacks against civil society. The type of digital attacks that are most concerning and relevant to our discussion today would be the use of commercial spyware. So these are really sophisticated software that can be used by the operator to infect someone's device, to read their text messages, including encrypted messages, examine photos, track a phone's location, and spyware like Pegasus, which is made by an Israeli-based group called NSO Group, which Johannes mentioned in his question, can also silently enable microphones and cameras to record conversations happening in the phone or the device's vicinity, such as in a room or a car. NSO Group argues that Pegasus, the spyware that they manufacture, is exclusively sold to governments, particularly law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies worldwide, for the purposes of fighting terrorism and countering organized crime, for example. However, we have discovered that Pegasus and other similar spyware have been used against civil society groups, including journalists and activists. Johannes mentioned the Pegasus project, which targeted or wanted to target 180 journalists worldwide, many of whom are women. But also our research has found that between July 2020 and November 2021, for example, 37 devices among El Salvador's media and civil society groups and individuals whose phones were infected with NSO's Pegasus spyware. As well, in July and August 2020, we found that NSO Group's Pegasus spyware was used to hack 36 personal phones belonging to journalists, producers, anchors, and executives at Al Jazeera, the media organization. In terms of gender is important when it comes to digital attacks, including the use of commercial spyware for surveillance against civil society groups. Because I think of at least three reasons. The first one is that women and minorities, they face heightened threats from the collection of their personal and professional information using spyware, as they can be used as part of intimidation tactics such as physical violence, entrapment for the purposes of imprisonment, for example, in terms of LGBTIQ individuals, as well as harassment online and offline. Secondly, we know from our research that attacks against women and minorities are also often directed not only against the individuals themselves, meaning not just the individual themselves are targeted for surveillance using the sophisticated commercial spyware, but also against others who are part of their lives. For example, their children. So when we looked at the use of Pegasus spyware against a Mexican investigative journalist, Carmen Aristegui, who was also a mother, her child, so her son, who was a minor at the time, was also targeted by this spyware. And the reason why multiple individuals would be targeted surrounding one person is because the objective is to create a chilling effect and to induce self-censorship so that they stop doing their work. And finally, women in particular also face threats online and offline. So meaning digital attacks cannot be separated from attacks offline. So for example, a lot of women would also face threats against their personal safety, such as threats of rape and sexual assault, again, not just to themselves because of the work that they do, but also to their families and friends. And so in summary, gender in the context of surveillance is important because gender, as I said, is implicated online and offline. They cannot be separated. Therefore, the use of surveillance equipment as a form of attack online is often accompanied by offline or physical attacks. And finally, I will say that it is concerning because it seems to be part of a broader trend as more and more women, as Aleksandra said, become more involved in operational activities or become more visible because of their activism, you know, whether as journalists or activists or academics. As more women and minorities become visible and involved in activities that challenge the governments or are critical of governments, for example, in terms of activism regarding land and environmental rights, being part of labor movements or indigenous movements, we are likely to see more women and minorities being impacted by digital attacks, particularly through surveillance using, or rather through the misuse of commercial spyware. So I'll end my remarks there for now. Thank you, Johannes.
Well, thank you so much for this very interesting contribution. We'll have a chance to look into, again, we'll have a chance to look into some of the aspects more. Yeah, thanks also for pointing out, I mean, obviously, surveillance, interferences with the right to privacy are one issue, but you made very clear how these can also translate into violations of all sorts of rights through harassment, through online, offline harassment, and impact all, you know, the entire range of human rights, and how it can impact those rights of men, women, boys and girls differently. Thank you so much. Plenty of stuff to discuss further. I will turn now to Mark Dixon. Mark, you, as someone who has played numerous roles within the security sector, including on counterterrorism, and collaborating closely with intelligence services. Why do you think gender is relevant for intelligence? Is this a common held view? And shall I take this one first, or let me pose the second question as well. The second question would be that you obviously have written about the differences between gender mainstreaming and gender parity in the security sector. Could you then also explain why is this different important, and how does it apply to intelligence services? Over to you, Mark.
Hi, Johannes. Good to see you. It's a real pleasure to be here with everybody, and a real privilege to be part of this panel. I'm going to try and keep this really short and just offer some bullet points, and then maybe we can get to some debate later on. I think the first point I'd make, and this is by no means meant to be a criticism of the question, I actually don't think gender is relevant to intelligence. It's imperative. And I guess my reasoning for that is when you look at the two, if you like, basic arguments, there is clearly not an obvious human rights argument to why gender is important. But if that is not good enough for most people, and it should be, there are clear operational advantages to that. And the way I would answer that, or the way I'd explain that, is by simply first looking, what is the purpose of national intelligence services? If you go and look on all national intelligence services websites, and nowadays they all have one, it will give you a fairly broad understanding of what their purpose is, what their function is. And as you'd expect, it sits around issues of national security that are anchored in the basic obligations any state has, economic prosperity, sovereignty, etc., etc. So when you look at the level that national intelligence services are working at, and the threat, risk and harm issues that they are having to deal with, there's a mantra certainly in the UK intelligence world, which is you do not know what you do not know. And even as a native English speaker, when that was first said to me, I had to sort of work that in my head for a little while. But it's basically an expression to describe where we are truly blind when it comes to threat, national threat. And the only way to try and reduce those two variables is to ensure that as an institution, we have diversity, and externally, we're able to look at all the different avenues to try and reduce the don't knows of the don't knows. And so when you're looking at that in the perspective of effective risk mitigation, either at the operational level or when you're doing strategic analysis, it's common sense. If you've got an organization that has 5% women or 10% women, then you clearly are not opening yourself to the ability to try and reduce those not knowns. And it's particularly relevant, obviously, in the area of counterterrorism, particularly as over the last 10 years or so, we've certainly seen a stronger conversation around what's termed a human rights-centered counterterrorism strategy. Well, if we're not actually embracing one of the most basic human rights, which is non-discrimination, then how can those counterterrorism strategies be that effective. And to answer the last part of the question, which is it a commonly held view? I've been out the executive world now for sort of 8 or 9 years, but what I would say is there a view that gender is relevant? I think that is growing. It still has an awful long way to go, but clearly we've heard from the Deputy Director of some pockets of good practice. Is it seen as imperative yet? I'm not completely convinced. So that would be my thoughts on the first sort of question. And then in terms of gender mainstreaming and gender parity, and it's already been alluded to, I think, by the Deputy Director. I mean, I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway for the audience. When we're looking at gender equality, we're ultimately trying to either reduce or in a utopian set of circumstances, ultimately ensure there's an absence of discrimination. And in this perspective, gender discrimination. And we can do that obviously through qualitative or quantitative tools, policies, and strategies. Parity, for me, is a quantitative process or quantitative way of going about that. But there's a key issue between that and some of the qualitative processes. Whilst it is it's a tool for us to use, the lack of gender parity is also a consequence and an indicator of gender inequality. So certainly when I was working in Kosovo, we did some work with the government around the National Action Plan. There'd been a tendency to focus on a quantitative aspect around quotas, which obviously have value, but that was at the cost of looking at some of the more qualitative areas. And so really, there was an emphasis on immediate output rather than outcome and impact in terms of really getting to the heart of some of the barriers that were causing women to both enter the police or the security service, but just as importantly, then be willing to stay in the organisation. And that is another issue around gender balance and gender parity, that people see gender balance and gender parity as the same. I don't. I see gender balance as numbers. Gender parity should reflect influence. And so when you look at some of these organisations, they will offer, yes, we have now got 14% or 20% women in the police or the security services. But when you actually find out what positions they hold, they're not holding command positions. So when you look at the actual definitions, people need to understand that. And I think ultimately where organisations fail is senior management don't understand these concepts correctly. They don't understand the difference between gender balance and gender parity. And then they certainly don't understand the difference between the quantitative and qualitative processes. And ultimately, it needs to be a comprehensive approach, including all of those. And I think once that message is understood by senior management and governments, then you might see a slightly more effective national action plan at the highest level, and then institutional gender perspective strategies.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, you are already developing some points we heard in the first intervention from our first panelist. You're developing further already. Clearly, we have a long way to go. Numbers are important, but it's only numbers, and we need the qualitative assessment. We need qualitative assessment not only in terms of the internal aspects of trying to ensure gender equality, but also for what you elaborated on earlier, in order to understand also the issues, the external aspects, the issues that intelligence services are working on and are trying to identify. We really need gender analysis throughout at all levels. So thank you also, Mark, for pointing that out. We come to our next speaker, Ms. Martin Brilly. Now, you come from a slightly different you come to this subject from a slightly different angle, that of intelligence in peacekeeping operations. Could you just please briefly explain how this differs from national intelligence services, and give us your perspective on why gender is relevant for this discussion? The second part of the question would then be how does a gendered perspective contribute to understanding of intelligence received and how intelligence is analyzed and used?
Thank you so much for this question. And of course, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor and a real pleasure to be able to participate to this roundtable this afternoon for you this morning. And indeed, it is important to stress and emphasize that peacekeeping intelligence with a hyphen is really a different beast. And the idea is that each state has really its own way to do intelligence, yet the main difference between the peacekeeping and the national intelligence service is that national intelligence often entails some clandestine practices, and this is inherently not part of peacekeeping intelligence. Of course, the UN peacekeeping does not do clandestine intelligence. The peacekeeping intelligence was a policy was adopted by the Department of Peace Operations in 2017 first without a hyphen, and then it was revised in 2019 with a hyphen, and from someone who has 4 name hyphens are quite important, and that was put there really to emphasize that peacekeeping intelligence was really a whole, a concept, a new concept put forward by the UN. And it is meant to be really a stepping stone for more effective and safer peacekeeping missions. It is meant to fulfill a dire and I would say some overlooked need to link enhanced situational awareness to really timely decisions and actions to improve the safety and security of UN personnel and of course the protection of civilians. But the peacekeeping intelligence, the concept did not obviously come out of the blue, and it followed many years of sustained consultation with the member states. Yet the challenge was to grasp what were the best practices that member states could put forward that could be applicable to international organizations that include almost all member states, all the states in the world. So given that each state has its own way to do peacekeeping or has their own way to do intelligence, the Department of Peace Operations did remain careful, both to avoid adopting one member state's way of doing intelligence over another, and of course not to use any tools, tactics, or procedures that would involve any kind of clandestine practices. There were also some debates on what would be the definition, the very definition of peacekeeping intelligence. And given the difficulties of that, the decision was actually not to give peacekeeping intelligence a definition, but in place of a definition to include 7 principles for peacekeeping intelligence practices. The principles are that peacekeeping intelligence has to be rule-based, obviously, so in link with peacekeeping mandate, in compliance, of course, with the Charter of the UN. It needs to be non-clandestine, and that is obviously very much emphasized. It needs to be conducted within designated areas of application, respect state sovereignty, must be independent of all aspects of national intelligence, of course, and non-mission entities. It needs to be accountable, executed by accountable and capable authorities, and of course, needs to be secure and confidential. So the process is to be akin to a standard intelligence cycle. So from the decision-making, tasking, assessment of requirements, issuing of direction, acquisition. So the UN talks about acquisition and not so much collection. It looks at examination and collation, analysis, and of course, dissemination. And the policy details how the information is to be classified, handled, shared, and used, and with which mechanism and tools it is to be managed. So it defines the roles and responsibilities of mission actors from the head of the mission down. And gender was never mentioned in the peacekeeping intelligence policy, nor in the 2017 version, nor in 2019 version. and I think it's been mentioned by the previous panelists that the role of gender has insufficiently, and not to say never, been systematically investigated in an intelligence perspective, and certainly never studied in the case of peacekeeping intelligence at the UN. Yet the UN does recognize gender as being key to integrated and forward-looking analysis, because of course, and I will not convince anyone here, that gender-based analysis does inform how conflict affect different people in different ways, in different times, and of course, how gender considerations are key in providing a comprehensive situational awareness. And gender is key to that integrated and forward-looking analysis in actually 3 different ways. It informs how conflict affect different people in different ways at different times. It does provide acute situational awareness by grasping a comprehensive dynamic with different types of actors. And of course, it is key in providing this analysis, which enable decision makers to make decisions to enhance the safety and security of the personnel and of course of civilians in general. It is key because it actually acknowledges the variety of roles in conflict settings and of men and women, and that can be simultaneous and also overlapping. And that was mentioned by the panelists as well before, to the importance of grasping not only traditional roles of men and women, but obviously non-traditional roles. And by traditional roles, we often see it from a Western perspectives. But the idea is to acknowledge that women can act, of course, as radicalizing elements while taking care of the households. Elder women, for example, can carry firewood to the market while serving as reconnaissance units for groups in their village, informing them where to carry attacks. When men can be used as logisticians by armed groups, as they are often unseen and not identified as relevant actors. So of course, one of the main challenge for any intelligence process is to be able to identify gender relevant indicators. And the acquisition of gender disaggregated data is obviously necessary for a good gender-based analysis. Yes, that gender disaggregated data must go beyond the sheer identification of numbers, because of course the number of men or women included in a conflict can be indicative of who is affected. But it fails to grasp what were the drivers of the events, of course, and why some actors were targeted over others. So numbers are necessary to grasp the magnitude of incidents and atrocities, yet what can be counted is obviously not limited to what counts. And I think that's a catchphrase that we need to be aware of the unknown unknown that Mr. Dixon was referring to. What can be counted is not limited to what counts is actually particularly relevant for gender, because qualitative assessment is obviously necessary to make sense of intangible factors, and in making sense of gender dynamics, which obviously impact, again, the safety and security of the personnel and of civilians in general. And the choice of quantitative measures and indicators can help to grasp, for example, how many women were present at certain meeting or how many women were raped, but they do not give information as to whether, why, and how women are affected. So when gender qualitative descriptions are included in an assessment, they tend to accompany, explain, and illustrate with examples the hard facts produced by quantitative indicators. And that is important because often only certain practices and short-term results are made visible. So gender has to be integrated into peacekeeping intelligence, obviously, to overcome the assumptions or expectations that, for example, women are more peaceful or naturally inclined to or capable of specific interpersonal tasks, notably as emotional caregivers, systematic champions, for example. These assumptions often ignore instances of violences that can be perpetrated, orchestrated by women, and for the sake of their own interests, but not only because they are instruments to women. So it's important to understand and grasp structural conditions that create realities and shapes women agency, including through the gendered socialization of both men and women. So one has to be careful, especially when we look at peacekeeping intelligence, not to box women into specific behaviors and set conditions on their inclusion and participations, when these conditions and expectations are not imposed on men. So by considering, for example, women as mere recipients of security, the analysts often risk to overlook the bigger picture, which drive conflicts and fail to capture early warning indicators. And that failing to tackle perception biases means that the threat and risk assessment are likely to overlook how conflict will affect different portions of the population differently. And of course, in return, how different actors are likely to react. So gender-based analysis is necessary to better grasp the activities of those who step out of their traditional roles, either to enhance protection of civilians or, on the contrary, to act as perpetrators, complicit actors in violent actions as well. It's also important, especially in the UN case, to look at the active role of men and women in conflict to better grasp not only how identity factors in conflict dynamic. We often refer to the importance of intersectionality, to look at how, for example, gender, community, age matter to make sense of usual behaviors in unusual contexts, or to usual actors adopting unusual behaviors. And of course, I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this really very insightful overview. And I see, I mean, obviously there are differences between peacekeeping intelligence and the work functioning of national intelligence services. And I see a lot actually of the issues you pointed out on indicators, gender indicators, and so on. Actually, you know, I see a lot of that in, for example, the publication here has at the very end, the tool number 14 has a very useful set of guiding questions for institutional self-assessment, and I see many of the questions that you raised actually included here, which should also be useful for institutions, intelligence institutions to conduct that assessment, to what extent they promote or not promote gender equality. But you also mentioned the needs to have intelligence rules based, as you refer to the 7 principles. Obviously, in that also peacekeeping intelligence does not differ from national intelligence in other situations, and this is something that we can turn to now. You emphasized, for example, accountability, and this is indeed one aspect that we would like to explore a little bit further as well. And for that, I will turn to I will open another round of questions. I see we have questions from the audience coming in already, but let me just have one other round of questions with our panelists. And I will ask Ms. Bakrevska-Dodovska, in your experience, what role do oversight bodies like parliaments play in the work of intelligence services, and can they be useful in integrating a gender perspective? So here we come to the accountability aspect. Ms. Bakrevska-Dodovska, do you want to?
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for the last question. Concerning the work of the Supervision Committee, I can say that it does not have a role on the issues on integrating women in intelligence services. The mandate of the current Supervision Committee is fixed. Sorry, I have some.
Ms. Bakrevska-Dodovska, can you hear us? Or seems you probably lost connection. Can I just check? But I see other panelists are online, so it's not me who lost connection. I understand. Maybe we'll come back in a second on this question of oversight in North Macedonia. But then I would like to move on. I would like to move on to Irene.
I think she's back, Johannes.
Okay.
Sorry, I have some technical problems.
So we lost you at some point.
Yes.
So just
sorry.
repeat.
Okay, I'll continue. I hope this time I won't vanish. I was speaking that supervision committee does not have a role on the issues that are connected with integrating women in intelligence services. The mandate of the supervision committee is fixed. It has a mandate to look upon the issues related to the respect of rights and freedoms, respecting the law and exercising the authorities of the intelligence agency, the methods and use that are used by the intelligence agency, the financial, personal and technical facilities, establishment of international cooperation on EU issues referring to the Commission, to the committee, and it has a mandate on other issues which are not mentioned. So the mandate is very fixed, and it cannot help on these issues we are struggling and facing. But I believe that as a step towards integration of women in intelligence services, offering authority to supervision committee to look upon gender issues would be a step closer to adopting a national strategy for this very important issue. Because the supervision committee is in charge not only for the intelligence agency, but also for the Agency of National Security, which is internal service in our country. So for both internal and foreign service. So it can be, as I mentioned, very important to encompass all these issues and to in adopting a national strategy. This is for future. As it is now, it will be impossible to come at the agency and to monitor whether the women's to how degree they are incorporated in the work of the agency.
Yeah, thank you so much. Clearly, there are challenges ahead, and oversight and gender and oversight is clearly one of them. Thank you so much, Aleksandra. Irene, what role do you think civil society can play in holding intelligence agencies to account in terms, both in terms of human rights generally and gender equality?
Thank you, Johannes. That's a great question. I will first highlight two significant challenges when it comes to documenting the misuse of commercial spyware by intelligence agencies, particularly against civil society, as my remarks indicated earlier. The first challenge is that this sector, the intelligence agency sector and the commercial spyware industry as a sector as well, they both lack transparency in many cases, and therefore it makes it very difficult to assess the true scale of or scope and participants in the commercial spyware market, for example. And therefore, civil society, the work of civil society and the media have really only scratched the surface regarding the details of participants involved in this industry particularly those that provide so-called off-the-shelf surveillance technology, both at home in the countries of interest and abroad as well. And then secondly, there is a wide array of surveillance technologies, and many of them are dual use. So the term dual use is with regard to tools that can be used for legitimate purposes, as I said, to investigate terrorism and organized crime, but they can also be misused, as my remarks earlier indicate. And therefore, any attempt to regulate the commercial spyware industry as a sector must address this dual use issue with regard to the tools and technologies that can be misused. In terms of the role of civil society in this, so I'm an academic myself, based at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. And for academics and for researchers, our role is really to provide evidence-based research to uncover the extent to which there is misuse of commercial spyware by intelligence agency. And as you can imagine, this type of research is very time-consuming because it is a secretive industry and is very technology or like knowledge intensive. You need people who can reverse engineer really sophisticated tools like spyware, and therefore there needs to be more funding into this type of research that we can uncover the scope of the problem. And the reality as well is that attacks against civil society is not as well known or as well covered by the media, in contrast to attacks against Fortune 500 companies or governments. And finally, I will say that civil society play a really crucial role in examining the extent to which this is a problem, because investigations into the threat of misuse of commercial spyware by law enforcement and intelligence agencies would not be possible without brave individuals coming forward with their devices, for them to be analyzed. And I'll just give one example. You may know Lujain Al-Hatlul, one of Saudi Arabia's most prominent activist, who is known for helping to lead a campaign to end the ban on women drivers in Saudi Arabia. She was released from jail in February 2021 on charges of harming national security. So there was commercial spyware made by NSO Group. So the Pegasus spyware was found on Al-Hatlul's device, and the infection was made possible because of a critical vulnerability in Apple's iPhones. And when we discovered this, we provided a sample to Apple last September. And because now Apple have the blueprint of the attack, it allowed Apple to fix the critical vulnerability in September. And those of you who use iPhones would have had a patch issued to fix this critical vulnerability. And thousands of iPhone users who were targeted by the similar software, the NSO Group's Pegasus software, was then warned by Apple that they had been targeted by state-sponsored attackers. So civil society plays a key role in that. Attacks against them are usually indicative of attacks against similar individuals elsewhere, and by knowing the safety and security threats that they face, our security, our collective security, is improved, as indicated by the Apple patch that happened last September. Thank you, Johannes.
Thank you so much for this very interesting contribution. I mean, clearly, accountability, oversight over intelligence services is always a very, very difficult issue in all spheres. State secrecy, transparency, lack of transparency, that is an issue that we see everywhere in this field. But then when it comes to spyware, we have added complications of business involvement, proliferation of technology, and so on. Mark, you used to work in law enforcement in the UK, and afterwards continued your work in international organizations like the OSCE or the EU. So what role do you think international organizations have to play, if any, in ensuring that intelligence services integrate a gender perspective into their work?
Thanks, Johannes. I think if you'd have asked me that question 30 years ago, I wouldn't have even understood the question. Certainly when I joined UK policing back in the mid-80s, I didn't even know the OSCE existed. things have changed maybe a little bit. I think the first point to make is, yes, I think they have a role to play, and a very important role to play. I think the role that they play in guiding, advising, suggesting things to intelligence services across the world regarding gender perspective is not dissimilar to what the same organisations have done in regards to security and justice sector reform. Yes, we know there are differences with the intelligence services functionality and purpose and operating procedures, but in terms of integrating gender perspective into the intelligence function, the principle, I think, is pretty much the same. And I think the likes of the OSCE, the EU, any other international governmental organisation, I think they're in a good position to do that. First and foremost, I think they have a good understanding of international rules-based systems and the framework, much more than I would suspect domestic institutions do. It's pretty much where they operate. There are third-party actors in terms of they are not seen as either fellow intelligence services or even competitors. So perhaps they have some level of impartiality to be seen as institutions that can develop policy, promote good practice, and when you look at the UN, the OSCE, there are dedicated human rights functions within those departments. So therefore, even some of the more advanced law enforcement or security services in the world that might well be educated around ensuring human rights compliance within the confines of their own domestic law, they don't have the level of focus and expertise some of the IGOs have. And then just to sort of bring that together, most IGOs certainly have at least a good regional coverage, if not global coverage. And so when we're projecting this message that a gender perspective is imperative in intelligence, it's pretty much like the criminal justice process. A criminal justice process in any country is only as strong as the weakest link. You can have the best prosecutors in the world, but if your police aren't operating, it will fall down. When we're looking at global strategic threats that intelligence services are dealing with, then those global strategic threats need to be dealt with by the global intelligence service community. And clearly, if we have certain intelligence services that are advanced in a gender perspective and are adhering to human rights legislation and principles, and then we've got others that are not, then there's going to be gaps in the performance there. And today's webinar is a good example. As advanced as maybe MI5 might be, or the CIA might be, I'm not seeing them put on webinars regarding intelligence and gender. So I think this actual webinar today is a fantastic visual representation, practical representation of the role that IGOs have got to make.
Thank you very much. I fully agree, absolutely, wholeheartedly. And I'm sure there's much more to come. I mean, the toolkit as such, toolkit number 14 as such is a good example. And I'm sure colleagues at ODIHR, at UN Women and DCAF will be have lots of ideas to continue this work and build on this one. So thank you very much. Sarah, Miriam, if I may. In the report you authored in 2020, which is entitled Finding the UN Way on Peacekeeping Intelligence, you make clear that there is a lot of work to be done regarding the integration of gender perspectives in UN intelligence. Can any lessons be drawn from there for the broader intelligence community? And do you have any specific recommendations in that regard?
Thank you very much for that question. In fact, it's more peacekeeping intelligence indeed, but I would start by saying that the UN is said to be a good student. So the organization is consultative by nature, and it adapts. And although it's the biggest international organization in the world, it does so surprisingly swiftly. And by that, I mean that at least in the past 3 years, official documents have been adapted to better explain the notion of gender. So even the very definition of gender put forward by the UN has evolved. And gender mainstreaming, acknowledging the role of men and women and of people of diverse identities, have been acknowledged. There are also briefings and trainings that have been put in place to inform senior leaders on the importance of integrating gender in all sectors of missions. Guidelines right now are being developed to facilitate and help missions to integrate gender into their daily practices, whether that be from the military side, civilian side, or police side. And of course, guidelines are being developed, including peacekeeping intelligence guideline, but again, more broadly in missions as well. And missions have been quite proactive in fostering closer consultations between units, notably engaging more closely with gender advisors and units. And gender is also being integrated in peacekeeping intelligence training, whether we talk about military peacekeeping intelligence training, military peacekeeping intelligence training of trainers, and the JMAC, so the Joint Mission Analysis Center training has had a first module on gender as well last winter. But obviously there are opportunities to be seized to improve how the UN does integrate gender and peacekeeping intelligence. And my work examines the extent to which gender is integrated into each step of the peacekeeping intelligence cycle, from the direction, acquisition, collation, examination, analysis, and dissemination. And if I look at more specific recommendations, of course, starting with the direction and tasking, I think gender still needs to be clearly identified in information requirements given by senior leaders of the missions and as priority information requirements. And grasping the non-traditional gender dynamic must be stated as a clear priority. So that means that specific information requirements need to be articulated in such a way that that information, that gender-related information, including but also beyond conflict-related sexual violence, can be included in analysis. The tasking should also be revisited to acknowledge the difficulties that is specific to the UN missions, which mean that the biggest UN missions operate in a very wide geographic area. And of course, the tasking needs to take into account the difficulty of the terrain, the lack of infrastructures, the lack of training and equipment, as well as those who acquire the informations, and the gender-specific difficulty of reaching certain sections, certain groups of the population as well. In terms of acquisitions, I think, of course, those who acquire the information need to be trained to ensure the safety and security of their local interlocutors, and of course, to recognize the wider variety of gender-relative indicators. And questions and observations and the reports that are often given to the analysts often focus on sexual violence. And of course, sexual violence is important to grasp and to monitor, but there are dynamics, gender dynamics, that go beyond conflict-related sexual violence, and that needs to be grasped to better understand the different context. So whereas the number of armed groups, the number of armed men, and the number of women and girls who are victims of conflict-related sexual violence matter, of course, indicators should grasp how men and women play a variety of roles in conflict settings. In terms of collation, evaluation, examination, one of the biggest challenges as well, mission-wise, is to store, of course, those information. So they are related to databases. And I think there are priority that should be given to develop categories and labels which capture gender dynamics. But that also means that there must be an explicit request from the senior leadership for the data to be gender disaggregated, of course, but there also needs to have training for database managers to be able to identify and record gender relevant data. in terms of the analysis, I think the role of the analysis is to make visible what are conceived as non-traditional roles of the populations with regards to conflict. And there should be much more frequent consultations between the analysts and those who acquire the information. So there must be attention should be paid to include as well non-militarized forms of securities and how different stakeholders understand insecurity and security that are related to gender. And finally, and it was mentioned before, often senior leaders do not necessarily grasp how gender-based analysis is necessary for better and more effective intelligence. And I think in all of those steps, analysts, those who acquire the information, database managers have a role to play in making gender visible to mission leadership by highlighting how gender factors in their analysis. So peacekeeping intelligence products, of course, should highlight the necessity for missions to capture and understand the role and impact of those who step beyond what are conceived as traditional role. And those information requirements need to be regularly revisited and readjusted for a better tasking. And of course, ultimately, for better situational awareness and ideally decision makings based on those intelligence output.
Thank you so much. Really plenty of very practical lessons and recommendations that can be also used in other parts of intelligence related work. I will move directly because we have a couple of, I am conscious of time, and we have a couple of questions from the audience. So I will directly move into the Q&A now. We have one question to Irene, but I'll open it up also for others, maybe to comment if they would like to. And the question is, do you think that involving gender issues in surveillance may lead to or would increase the level of privacy protection, having in mind the different approaches mentioned that women have?
Thank you, Hannes, and thank you for the question. I mean, I think we need to be careful of approaching it from a lens of just at gender, right? I think there needs to be a concerted effort to ensure that whenever gender is added into the equation, that it is meaningful. Yeah, so I would say that there needs to be a more deliberate effort, a more concerted effort. And I think it is, when it comes to such an important issue as privacy, governments, UN member states have a big role to play, because we see that there are still many countries around the world that don't have privacy laws. And yet many of these countries are also passing really powerful or really draconian laws that would enable intelligence agencies to purchase tools and as Johannes mentioned earlier, to use them with very little accountability, transparency, and oversight. And so, yes, obviously gender is very important, but I think there needs to be more than that, in the sense that it needs to be done in a thoughtful and concerted manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, there's a lack of privacy standards across the world, but there are also very, very broad exemptions and concerning law enforcement work and concerning the security sector, which is another obstacle very often that we observe in our work when it comes to protection of privacy rights. Obviously, do other colleagues would like to comment on that? I pass on the question to.
Hannes, I could maybe just offer something. I do feel as if I've turned from a poacher to a gamekeeper. As a domestic law enforcement officer from the UK involved in counter-terrorism operations, I did breach people's human rights. Predominantly, it was Article 8 of the Convention in Europe, which was their right to privacy. And it was done within the confines of the legislative requirements of the country. And when I look back now, I'm still fairly confident that we did that with some diligence, proportionality, and necessity. But I agree with Irina that the key issue for me, when I look back now, is when I looked at the decision-making process to conduct those operations, some of which were fairly intrusive. When I look now at the decision-making process and the people involved in it, it was all white males. And as much as we tried our very best to do our very best job, it clearly lacked some intersectionality in terms of, did we consider all the issues and all the impacts of it? So I think if you are looking at trying to put systems and processes in place that allow you to ensure as reasonably as you possibly can, that you have a comprehensive understanding of what the impacts are, and that you are considering those very important issues of proportionality and necessity in the context of counterterrorism, national security, and potentially saving lives, then you're developing a far more robust process that can stand up to better scrutiny.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. I mean, necessity, proportionality, the other aspect which is key of the test is non-discriminatory. So there we also should have the gender analysis and the impact, the gender-based, potential gender-based impact really intrinsically within the assessment in order to ensure human rights compliance. Do other panelists want to comment on that? Otherwise, I would ask another question for anyone who would like to comment on this one. How can we practically increase women participation in intelligence services in countries or contexts where cultural and social perceptions towards women are significantly discriminatory? And would you have any advice for a young woman trying to start her career in that sector? Who wants to go first?
Okay, I think I'll try to answer these questions. The answer is that we have passed the experience how to integrate women in intelligence services. And I think this is the path out of our experience. We have more than 20 years functioning of the intelligence agency, with women being part of it, building the institution step by step, but not being in a senior leadership position nor being part of operations. So we've come to a period when we have realized that we do need some mechanisms how to improve that, how to be better. And that's why we've considered that the new law would be, the legal framework would be one good basis for integration of women. And therefore, in Article 27, as I mentioned, we determined that we cannot allow, the intelligence agency cannot allow discrimination based on gender. I think the legal framework is a guarantee for further development of this issue for the intelligence agency. And I agree that numbers are not important, are irrelevant at a certain point. But we've passed the previous experience when women were part of the work, and now we should search for other mechanisms how to provide integration of women. We are mentioning in the law, in the programs, they are part of the decision-making processes. So I think only in this manner we can break the stereotypes, the cultural stereotypes. that are present in our country. And for the second question, how to be part of intelligence agency, also we envisage with the new law that there will be a public competition for employment in the intelligence agency. So the last December, the first public competition was published, and we employed a new young people to work for the intelligence agency. Otherwise, there is also on our website link that somebody, if wants to apply for a job, he can send the documents, and if we need the profile of that kind of person, we consider the mail, and after that we call the people who've sent the mail.
Thank you very much. Definitely a really, I mean, proactive outreach is obviously key there as well. Does anyone else want to comment on that question? I don't see that is the case. Then I have another question for Mark, actually. But again, others might want to comment on that as well. Can you share some best practices for addressing violence, including harassment against women, as well as provision of care services for survivors in intelligence services?
Thank you, Hannes. Well, I think it goes without saying, we need obviously the very clear normative and policy framework, but I'd actually make the point when we're formulating that, does the actual formulation have a gender perspective? I was recently invited to a working group to look at some legislative reform in North Macedonia, and I looked around the room, and not surprisingly, it was full of white men. So even when we're formulating this legislation, even with the best of intentions, you know, and I'd like to think I come with a fairly strong gender perspective, but we need that diversity at the developmental stage. So I actually think it starts there in terms of when we look at changing, developing, or creating a new normative and policy perspective. Well, we should make sure that the consultation process has that diversity and has that intersectionality in terms of its perspective. If and when we have that in place, clearly we're now down to this sort of implementation phase. I think everybody on this webinar will know that's where, you know, historically we often fall down. So I think for me, certainly within public institutions such as security services, police services, intelligence services, there has to be some very strong messaging from the leadership. Clearly, if we've got parity, gender parity, then that message has even more value. Sadly, we are still struggling with that parity and representation in some of these organisations. So the realities are we have to deal with the leadership we've got. There's actually a very good book that's recently been published called Good Guys, which is a publication around how men can champion gender issues and champion women in the workplace, but still allow women to have the space and currency to be able to do what they need to do. So I think sometimes there is a worry that men worry that they're maybe encroaching and they don't want to say anything. Well, this actual book is a good read, and it certainly offered me some tips on how you can sort of be more effective. So I think leadership and leadership messaging is clear. And then training, obviously, and ensuring that training is implemented across all the staff. And there is a clear understanding of what the processes are. And then finally, in respect of that, certainly in my own experience in the police service, we had the legislation, we had the policy, we actually had some very positive messaging by senior staff, be them male or female, but the action, the actual prompt action wasn't there. And the strength and mindset at the operational level to challenge. and certainly in my time in the police service in the UK, a mantra sort of came in, which was not to challenge is to collude. And it was very much around making sure that we've all got a positive obligation to confront this sort of behaviour. That is not an easy thing to do because we're looking at changing hearts and minds. But I think if you've got that architecture in place, then you're certainly moving an institution further down the line. And in terms of sort of care packages and support, it very much goes hand in hand with what I've just said in terms of that support mechanism certainly needs to be framed around the individual, should be promoted and complemented for making that representation rather than and the narrative and I think the actual question used the actual expression survivor rather than the victim narrative. And I think if we can change these slightly, albeit subtle, sort of expressions, it will slowly start to change people's mindset around some of this.
Thank you so much. And I just realized that we have more questions than I initially saw. So there are quite a few still there. I'm not sure if we managed to go through all of them, but at least two I think I would still want to take. And one is for Sarah. Are there attempts to integrate a gender perspective in UN peacekeeping intelligence policy? What can member states do to help putting this forward? So the question of member states, what can they do to put this forward?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this question. Yes, the UN is looking into revising its policies and guidelines right now to integrate a gender perspective and to mainstream gender throughout the activities of the mission, but including in peacekeeping intelligence. With regards to what member states can do, I think it's been mentioned, but I will emphasize it as well, is that beyond having numbers and gender parity, there's the question of training is also key. To make the most, of course, of a diverse workforce. So I think what member states can do is to hone and provide gender-based training as well in all sectors of the personnel they either deploy to missions or to those who are interested in working in UN missions and in peacekeeping. So gender training that are more specific to certain sectors are certainly something that member states can invest in. And I'm thinking about, for example, gender-based peacekeeping intelligence to really develop this expertise. And I think in general, gender training exists, but unfortunately, what is lacking often is that gender training is not systematically led by gender experts. Sometimes there's this conflation between training led by a woman versus a training that is really based on gender expertise. So there's this deconflation to be made at the member states level. So to provide gender experts to training. And of course, in addition, if you're going to specialize training, to see how gender actually matters for the day-to-day work beyond normative concept. And what we see often in gender training, even at the member state level, is a normative hammering of how there must be more women, how women must be taken into account, but less practical way to do so. So in the daily work of analysts or the daily work of different personnel. So developing gender perspective that are specific to different types of work is certainly one way to improve and to make visible that imperative relevance that has been highlighted by Mr. Dixon previously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking here at Isabella because I see we are approaching the end of the webinar and we could continue this, but do we have time for one more last question? Maybe
I would say the last question because we actually already we passed the time. We should have finished at 4:30.
Just very brief.
Yes, let's the last question. Thank you so much.
Just very briefly to Irene and maybe others as well. Wait, let me see, the question is, what do organizations like UN Women need to do as a priority to make sure women activists and women's rights organizations are better protected against misuse of commercial spyware? As a concluding question.
Thank you, Johannes, and thank you for the question. I don't work for UN Women. I think we have someone who works here at UN Women. But I think from my perspective, I think there needs to be better recognition by UN Women and other UN organizations and member states that digital attacks against civil society is a growing problem, and it is being perpetrated by democracies and authoritarian countries alike. And it's only going to be more of a problem as more technologies enter the surveillance and intelligence world, which, as we have discussed earlier, is not exactly the most transparent sector, and therefore, as Johannes has already mentioned previously, there needs to be more accountability and transparency when it comes to the intelligence and security sector, and this is certainly something that UN Women and other UN agencies can play a significant part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm afraid we will have to stop here, but I think there were so many, it was a really, really rich discussion, and many very, very important questions which were raised, which unfortunately we cannot discuss all, but I think this is, as always, a webinar like this is only a beginning of it. Should be only a beginning of a discussion that will be continued. With that, I would like to thank you from my side, and I will hand over to Isabella.
Thank you so much, Johannes. Thank you for helping us with the moderation during this event. It has been really a great pleasure to participate in this discussion in this webinar on integrating gender perspective in intelligence service. There's so much actually, issues which we tackled here, but, to wrap up, I think there's a common sense that intelligence services operating, there's this common sense, this intelligence services which are operating in increasingly complex environments, and that access to this even more, it has been also underlined very often by a lot of our guests, that this access to ever more sophisticated technologies, that in this situation, the gender has a very decisive role to play, both in terms of operational effectiveness and as well as accountability to international legal norms and standards on human rights. It has been underlined, we are here from the side of the OSCE ODIHR. We are the specialized unit, the Human Rights, Gender and Security Program, which assists OSCE participating states in integrating human rights and the gender perspective into security. And this program has been specifically designed to assist the security sector, meaning armed forces, law enforcement, penitentiary system agencies, and the national security agencies, the intelligence, and also its oversight. It is a very important component which has been tackled, and Aleksandra Bakrevska, she was mentioning the oversight. This oversight of a security sector is very crucial here. So this program, we focused in our work, in our initiatives on integrating this human rights and the gender perspective into the delivery of a security, but also, let's not forget, on the human rights and the fundamental freedoms of a security and defense sector personnel. Just to round up, because we already passed the time, so one more time, let me express my very sincere thanks and gratitude to all our speakers, to our co-organizers of this discussion, to our long-standing partners from UN Women and from Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, and to also all the participants, to representatives of a civil society, international community, and other institutions. I've seen some state institutions also from some member states, participating states attending. So thank you to all. Thank you to the interpreters. And thank you to Natasha, Alvaro, Johannes, and everybody, other colleagues who also helped with the questions and answer sessions. We would like to remind also that this webinar recording will be available on the DCAF YouTube page in all languages. Maybe Megan, maybe you would like to add something very, very briefly. And really a very big request to all the participants, basically to complete the webinar survey, which we will post in a moment. This is really very helpful for us, also not only for our internal reporting, but also in order to decide on the next steps. So the series will continue. The series of gender and security events and webinars will continue, and the next one will take place in May. It will be dedicated to the role of gender military advisors. And from my side, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Megan, I think you wanted maybe to drop briefly a line. Would you say to maybe very briefly something from DCAF?
Isabella, thank you. Really just to thank all the participants also on behalf of DCAF for joining the session. Really to give a warm welcome to those of you I see from Georgia. This is the first time we've provided Georgian translation, and I think it's a good boost to provide more translation. I'll drop now in the chat a link to the sort of major homepage for the Gender and Security Toolkit, where you can find translations of the tools, not just in, as was mentioned, Arabic, French and Spanish, but we have most of the toolkit now in Ukrainian, Georgian, some in Russian, the languages of the Western Balkans. So I really encourage you to find your own home language. Thank you again to all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. And we hopefully see you in May during our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The survey will be now, yes, posted now or at the end of it, right? Natasha? Yes, you already see here.